Hi guys, this is Draco from Legends in Our Free Time, and I am starting a new series about chess games that I have from time to time. I mean, it's perhaps a weird thing for me to record, but it's something that I've been really heavily getting into, and this particular game is one that is completely legend-based, because this is one that I actually had against Jughead. So, I will be commentating on this, and without further ado, let's begin. Jughead is playing the white pieces, and I'm playing the black pieces. Jughead opens with pawn d3, which is, I suppose it's a okay move. I personally would perhaps move it a square ahead to seize the centre, but whatever, what can you do? I open with pawn to e5, which is, I always prefer to open with the king pawn to open up the centre and free my queen and bishop right away, and it leads into some good moves later on. He then continues with a3, which I don't really think at this point he has a particular plan, since it's generally an accepted rule of thumb in chess that you should try and gain control of the centre early on, which you will see my next move consolidates my effort to try and gain the centre. He just moves on with b4, again not really concentrating on a central assault, but you know, what can you do? I then go with g6 with my pawn, and I'm doing this to free up the square that's been vacated by the pawn so that my bishop can occupy it and it can control the long diagonal, since when my e-pawn moves, his rook will then be under attack. I think I move my knight in the way of that later, so I think that kind of impedes my attack, but it's generally a good square to put a bishop on. He does the same, so nothing really to say about that move. My bishop then goes on that square. He moves his pawn forward on the h-file. And there's my knight gaining an outpost of sorts, since it does have a threat on some central squares and of the squares that his pawns could use on the king side, but generally it's not really doing much. His bishop then goes on its own diagonal. I think he was copying my moves actually, but I can't be sure. They are okay moves. I then move my bishop out, since it's good to try and develop your minor pieces, and it's guarding my d-pawn. He moves his bishop, so he's got both of his bishops developed, and I've got both my bishops and a knight developed, so I get my last knight into the game, and that's all my minor pieces developed. He then moves his knight, blocks the queen, but again, if the king pawn is moved, then his queen is free to move, same with his c-pawn, and that gives his queen a couple of nice diagonals to work with. I castle on the king side, basic defensive move. Perhaps I could have saved that for when I needed to rather than when I could, since I could have used this turn to further develop any attacking plans that I had, but whatever, doesn't really matter. He then moves his central pawn forward. I move my pawn, c-pawn forward, putting it in attack range and basically inviting him to start exchanging, which I wouldn't really mind if he captured my pawn, since I could then recapture with my knight. But he doesn't go for that, he just increases the central pressure with d4. So I think, right, you know what, fuck this. So instead of going for the b1, I go for the d-pawn so that I can try and keep control of the centre. As I've said before, it's central control that's important. He recaptures, which is fairly standard. And instead of recapturing, I move my pawn up, and later you'll see this is actually quite a vital move in how the rest of the game progresses, in that I chose to move forward and essentially lock his pawn in place rather than recapture it. He moves his knight, so that's all of his minor pieces developed from their starting squares. Then my queen moves out. I've got all my minor pieces in place, so I may as well get my queen involved. It's generally not good to move your queen before your minor pieces, your bishops and knights, but here we go. And my queen again is bearing down again on that central pawn square. Moves his pawn forward. I think perhaps he's inviting me to capture with my knight, but that's just a purely stupid move, because obviously pawn immediately recaptures. I move my a pawn forward, threatening the one on the b square, and of course if he captures I have the option of recapturing with my rook or my queen, and this leads into quite a threatening attack from quite soon. Moves his knight forward to another outpost, covering some different squares, but I probably wouldn't have moved it away from the centre, since he definitely wants to be trying again to control the central 4 squares. I then capture with my pawn. I'm kind of surprised that he didn't, well, maybe not surprised, but he could have recaptured with his a-pawn, which then I probably would have just swooped in and captured his rook with my own, which his queen could then recapture, which is a pretty basic exchange. But instead he chooses to move his knight forward and threaten my bishop, so he's clearly ignoring the pressure on the queen side, and he's instead attacking the centre and the king side, which in itself isn't bad. You know, he's going for my central position, which is holding most of my attack power. I just continue with capturing the pawn, and here it would be very easy for him to make a critical mistake in this situation. What's your intuitive response in this situation? Whatever it is, I hope it's not recapturing the pawn with the rook, because that's an extremely bad move. All that would result in is queen moving down to b4 check. The king would be in check, you'd have to move the king away to defend it, and then I would be then free to capture the rook if I so wanted. It would be a bit of a sacrifice since then the bishop could recapture, but it's just an excuse for my queen to move closer and put the king in check. So generally not something that he wants to do, and thankfully he doesn't do that. He instead captures with the bishop. So there we go, and he's now got access to a long diagonal and threatening my rook that's next to my king, but not too worried about that. And I go down with the rook. Yes, this is where recapturing will be bad, sorry, because back then the bishop was guarding the pawn and I couldn't, the rook, and I couldn't have captured because then I get recaptured by the bishop. But this is the point where if he captures with the rook, I put him in check, he moves away, and then he just loses his rook instantly, and I get access to some nice squares in the corner. He goes on with just capturing the centre as he was before, so he claims a bishop, which is a bit like, yeah, well, you know, but I then recapture with my pawn. I think that pawn does something later on as well anyway, but no. He then resolves the tension of my queenside attack just by castling himself, so that made me think a bit like, oh well, so I've got to kind of pull back now. So instead I double my rooks on the queenside so that, again, he can't really recapture safely since he'll just get captured by the second rook. And which he chooses not to do. As you can see, he's moving the rook into safety, and obviously I can't move my rooks down into the square that his rook was just in, since it would get recaptured by the knight. So instead I move my queen back because I see a nice diagonal that I can exploit with some support, and my initial thought was to get the bishop and the queen on the same diagonal, and if he wasn't paying attention that could be a really easy checkmate there, but the game doesn't really go in that direction. Moves his pawn forward, and I think to myself, I can see an attack here, and I hope he makes the wrong move here, which he kind of does. I capture the pawn, and it's evident here that he should be aiming to recapture, but the question is with which piece. The worst piece to do it with would be the bishop, because the bishop is guarding the king quite well, and moving the queen could be a bit dangerous to capture since it puts it in a slightly more vulnerable position, but using the rook I think is generally quite good. But he does capture with the bishop, which allows me to instantly move queen to g3 check. The only way that he can block it, this move is forced, he has to move the bishop back into position to guard the king, so essentially the bishop is out of the game at this point as long as my queen's still on that square, because he cannot move the bishop, otherwise he'll put himself in check. I then move my knight to e4, so I'm just furthering my position and pushing further into his territory. Queen to f3, obviously he's threatening my queen and my knight at the same time. He can't safely take either without losing his queen, but it's still a threat, and I'm guessing he was thinking my queen was extremely threatening in this position, so he thought it was worth getting rid of my queen, even at the cost of losing his own. But I find an extremely powerful move here in bishop d4 check, which is extremely bad for him since he has to guard the king this turn, and he chooses not the wisest way to do it with knight recaptures, which unfortunately loses his queen due to my rook capturing. But that bishop check itself was quite nasty, and losing the bishop was well worth capturing the queen. He recaptures with his knight, but again I'm still up in material and I've generally got a very favourable position. I bring my knight forward again with knight to c3, and this generally, if you have a talent for seeing moves ahead, you will see that there is a way that this match is going to conclude, because the match only goes on for another 4 moves and they're all basically forced. He moves his rook so as to defend it, but rather than consolidating a defensive position, he goes in and captures my pawn, which at this point I don't care about. I don't care about losing material. I can clearly see a win here. Move my knight forward to e2, which is check. There is only one square that he can go to. He has to move into the corner. I then move my knight again f4. It's not being attacked by anything, and he really should have seen the threat here, because I'm planning something really nasty with this position. He doesn't really do much with it though. He rook g1, well, I suppose he's kind of doing it then because he's guarding the square that he thinks my knight's going to attack, but it's not my knight that's going to be doing the attacking. I then move my rook all the way down to a1, and this obviously serves the purpose of it's pinning the rook to the king, since again the rook can't move vertically without putting the king in check, plus if he recaptures then my knight is free to come in and capture the bishop, but no, afraid not. His rook captures my knight, and then my queen simply moves forward, capturing the bishop, which is checkmate, since he cannot capture the knight, he cannot capture the queen, sorry, because the knight's guarding it. He cannot capture my queen with the rook because, like I said, it's pinned to the king. He has absolutely no options, and that is game. So I hope you enjoyed this little game, and if you enjoy it, I shall commentate more matches. So yeah, hope you liked it. See you later, guys.